Welcome to our panel discussion, To Vax or Not to Vax? Sponsored by Union Presbyterian Seminary's Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation and the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership. And Union Presbyterian Seminary's new Master of Arts in Public Theology degree program. Are you called to be a Christian leader in the public square? Know someone considering theological education? Contact our admissions directors at admissions@upsem.edu. Our panelists are Dr. Jerome E. Williams, Jr., Senior Vice President of Consumer Engagement for Novant Health, and Dr. Augustus Parker, Medical Director for Women's Urgent Care Centers, Facilitator for Diversity, Inclusion, and Health Community Ambassador. Our moderator is Dr. Rodney Sadler, Associate Professor of Bible and Director of the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation. Dr. Sadler, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so very much, Mike. It's always a blessing to be introduced by the voice. I'm excited to join you all today for this conversation, to vax or not to vax, a question about ideology and medicine. And as we come together today, this is going to be one of the concerns that we bring up. As we wrestle with this issue about vaccinations, are we talking about whether we should or shouldn't? Is this a matter of medical truth, or is this a matter of ideological persuasion? We're going to focus today with my two brilliant colleagues, brilliant panelists. I'm excited to be joined today by Dr. Gus Parker, who has worked with us with the Rap Track program before and has a wonderful story of just inclusion in the African-American inclusion in the medical industry in his own family. And I'd love for him to talk a little bit about that. And we've got Dr. Jerome Williams, a gentleman I've been trying to get together with for some time now, brilliant leader, young director, vice president at Novant Health. And want to look forward to talking to both of you as we deal with this question today. And the question today really has to do with the healthcare of African Americans. As this pandemic has unfolded, we've noted that African Americans have far too often, along with Latinos and other minorities, become infected with this disease at a rate higher than their white counterparts, become succumbed to this disease at a rate higher than their white counterparts. And as we began to think about vaccination as a way out of this pandemic, we found that African Americans and Latinos tend to be vaccinated at a rate lesser than their white counterparts. So a lot of these issues are quite complex and they are involved. So for example, one of the reasons that many African Americans have not been vaccinated has to do with ideology, a fear of public healthcare system, a history of abuse by governmental agencies in the past, has led many African Americans to be suspect. Latino Americans, given the way that immigrants have been treated in this nation, also have considerable fear of the way that they'll be treated within this larger system. So there are some legitimate fears and concerns that govern what's going on with this vaccine, how it's being rolled out, what's the role of government in it, et cetera, et cetera. As we get started today, though, I want people to know a little bit about the two of you as individuals, just so that they know why you are experts able to talk about this. Dr. Parker, I want to start off with you. You have a story that is incredibly fascinating. You are not the only doctor in your family. Tell me a little bit more about your family and why it is that you have all gone into the vocation that you've chosen.
Thank you, Dr. Sadler. You use the term expert, so I use that very loosely, I hope, because we are bringing our unique perspective of our knowledge that we've gained through listening to each other. Yeah, you mentioned that we are I'm afraid, unique in that we are a family of people of color, of African-American family, that is unique, that we have 4 physicians in our immediate family. It is very not lost on me that I don't gauge the fact that my children, I have 3, are physicians, and I don't view that as success. A lot of people would say that's something of success. They're actually better people than they are physicians. But I never pushed them to go into medicine. My wife, my beautiful bride, Cheryl Gibbs Parker, we stress the importance of education, and we gave them every opportunity. That being said, I'm very pleased with the fact that they ultimately chose the field of medicine. They all attended HBCU school and undergrad, Hampton University, and then they matriculated to UNC Chapel Hill Medical School, Howard University Medical School, and The Ohio State University College of Medicine. And myself, my background is in women's healthcare as an obstetrician gynecologist. I was the director of robotic surgery for a healthcare system and clinical professor at The Ohio State University. I think my children's, if there's a message in them going into medicine, it was in giving back to the community. I don't see their engagement in medicine as strictly for the interest in the science, but I think the one thing that my wife and I did was teach them about giving back to the community. And so hopefully, if in some way, both my wife, who's an educator, and myself were able to model that for them, they chose that unique path. And I talk about mining diamonds as a format for how we engage and mold and shape. And initially I thought of a sculptor, but creating a diamond requires pressure. And there's a lot of pressure in existing and thriving in this landscape with so many minefields in it. I think it's not lost on any of us that we need to reflect the community we serve. And so I think it's great. Dr. Williams, as well as myself, have participated in programs to engage and encourage young people to think about a career in medicine. We've looked and participated in Black Men in White Coats, a program that certainly supports and models the pathway for young people to gain entrance into the field of medicine. So I think it's important, the modeling, but also I think just a way to give back. And certainly as an African-American family, we have accepted that role in addition to our role as practitioners.
Thank you so much for that. And I continue to be in awe of what you and your wife have done, and literally committing your family to the work of lifting up African-American health. Dr. Williams, I want to ask you a similar question. Just what is the need for African-American physicians as we begin to address the disparities that exist in the healthcare system? Is this a significant need? Can white doctors not do the same thing?
So first of all, thank you, Dr. Sadler, for having me on this important panel for discussion of an important topic. So the reality of the situation is that the numbers of African-American providers out there are not great. This percentage is a small percentage. So that if we really want to improve the health of our communities, it will take our white brothers and sisters to have cultural competency to understand the history of medicine as it relates to people of color, so that they can appropriately, with true empathy, understand where people of color are coming from as it relates to distrust of the healthcare system. So that said, yes, we do definitely need an increased number of African-American and Hispanic Latinx providers to care for our communities. But that that increase in number won't occur overnight. And so as such, we're going to have to ensure that all providers are trained in cultural competency across the spectrum so that they can effectively care for the individuals that they serve.
Well, thank you. Thank you both for that. So we definitely see that there's a need right now for more Black and brown medical professionals to begin to address the disparities that exist. And as we start talking about disparities, I think that we are in the midst of an instance that has shown us what these disparities really look like. If nothing else, over the course of this last year, the George Floyd incident has showed us that there is great injustice racially in the criminal justice system. By the same token, the COVID pandemic has demonstrated that there are great disparities in the healthcare system around the issue of race. And as we've been wrestling with this notion of the disparities that exist, we've seen the pandemic ebb and wane, but one of the things that we've noticed is that African Americans have been hit harder by this disease. There are a number of factors as to why this has existed. But as we've begun to come out of the pandemic, we've noted that there's also been a lag in African American vaccinations. Some people have attributed this lag to a history of problems of trust within the larger system. I'd love it if you would talk a little bit about why it is that African Americans might not trust the healthcare system when it comes to things like vaccinations. Would you like to start with that, Dr. Williams?
Yes, thank you. So first and foremost, we have known for a long time of the inequitable distribution of services, inequitable distribution of power, inequitable distribution of money, inequitable distribution of resources across our communities. Those inequitable distribution of those activities result in really inequitable health outcomes. And so when COVID hit, there was no surprise, myself and Dr. Parker, there was absolutely no surprise that we were going to see disparate outcomes as it relates to COVID. Why? Because we see disparate outcomes as it relates to maternal outcomes. We see disparate outcomes as it relates to treatment of heart attack, stroke, and the list goes on and on and on. And so we've lived this for decades and have been educating and fighting against this for decades. So it was really no surprise to us that there was going to be disparate outcomes. Now, why do we see that? Okay, why do we see that? Some of it has to do with healthcare distrust, but also it has to do with the complex situation of social forces that live in our community, right? So when we look at chronic medical problems, 80% of chronic medical problems have nothing to do with biology, have nothing to do with genetics, but have all to do with the environment that one lives in, behaviors and the environment that one lives in. And if there's housing insecurity, food insecurity, lack of social connectivity, lack of social capital, lack of upward mobility, all of those have a much more profound impact on one's health than biology and genetics. So as I started off earlier, when you see the inequitable distribution of those activities, those power structures in our communities, there's no wonder you will see disparate outcomes. As it relates to the historical distrust, we've all heard of the Tuskegee experiment. We actually recently, folks have learned about the Henrietta Lacks cells that are being used, and there are countless other stories. Those are the two that really stand out, but there are countless other stories, and that has led to a distrust of not just healthcare institutions, but institutions in general. And I will say, Dr. Sadler, that we have to somehow overcome that, because the continued feeling of distrust, some real, some perceived, continues to affect our health overall, right? And so when you don't have an opportunity to see a primary care physician on a regular basis who knows you, knows your family, knows your health history, when you don't have an opportunity to see a specialist because of fear, it's only delaying preventative care and much needed care. So we have a lot of work to continue to educate our communities to understand, one, first and foremost, absolutely, there's been historical challenges in the healthcare system. Can't ignore that. First and foremost, you got to come out of the gate and admit that there's been historical challenges. And we have to continue to challenge healthcare systems, healthcare providers to provide culturally competent care. However, at the same time, we also have to challenge our communities of color to say, hey, look at the data. Look at the data. Folks of color are succumbing to COVID-19 at a greater rate than our majority communities. We do know vaccinations reduce that significantly. And so therefore, we have to continue to educate our communities of color about the benefits of vaccinations, the benefits of seeing a healthcare provider, the benefits of having preventative care, because if we don't, we will continue to see these disparate outcomes. So we have to hit it from both angles, from the healthcare system trust angle, but we also have to educate our communities that we have to move beyond that and understand how we can, one, advocate for ourselves. That's very important. Advocate for our family members, educate our populations of how to ask pertinent questions of a provider. Okay, challenge our providers to respond to our needs, and then hopefully by hitting it from two different directions, we will achieve a healthier community.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Dr. Parker, let me ask you.
Yeah, Dr. Sadler and Dr. Williams, if I might add, Dr. Williams talked about the social determinants of healthcare. When you talk about not just access, but education, housing, food insecurities, and all those things. And we've gotten a little bit more mature in our thinking about systemic racism that you mentioned earlier, whether it be in policing or whether it be the criminal justice system, but also in healthcare. And zip code, where you live, matters. And these social determinants can be traced back to the systemic racism of redlining that existed in our communities, which I'm sure most of you are aware of. But certainly that redlining, which really, people in the 1930s, the leaders of the cities drew lines around communities and a red line to separate the mixing of races. But it codified within those red line districts lower standards of living, lower property investment, predatory lending, and devaluation of the property. And so there weren't resources to have the kind of things that we need to build up our communities, the value in those communities. Companies and plants and factories came in and they built their factories near those areas because the land is cheaper. But guess what? That also seeps into our water, our air, and pollutes us. And so there's that a better knowledge of how that systemic racism has crept, not just politically and socially, but also into healthcare. So yeah, certainly zip code matters, and there's an underlying current of systemic racism. One of the big things that we can't ignore, Dr. Williams mentioned Tuskegee, Henrietta Lacks, the medical experiments that were done on our slave ancestors, but also the ugly history of eugenics in the state of North Carolina in particular, the forced sterilization of women and young boys against their will and against their knowledge. So there's all that mistrust that's built up. And to Dr. Williams' point, it's incumbent upon us not to ignore it, not to push it away, but to acknowledge it and lead with that we have an acknowledgement that we understand that, but we've got to move forward. And how can we engage you to trust the healthcare system now? And there's a lot of great messaging in what we try to do to engage the Black and Brown community.
Thank you. Thank you both for your answers in this regard. I think a lot of people struggle with the issue about whether to be vaccinated today because of those reasons that we've just talked about. But then there's also been, in recent days, some significant pushback from people we might not expect. Pastors, particularly evangelical pastors, have encouraged their congregations not to get vaccinated. Many people have even talked about the pandemic as a myth. How do we begin, as particularly as we're talking to a number of people of faith, how do we begin to confront this sort of theological and ideological argument against vaccination and encourage people, particularly people at risk in Black and brown communities, to get vaccinated? Dr. Parker?
Yeah. What I want to say about that is I think it's very important about where people get their information and who do they trust. Where do they get their information and who do they trust? So I think certainly there are myths, particularly related around religious theology, that need to be debunked. And some of that is, for example, that there's no cow's blood in the vaccine, that there's no aborted fetal tissue in the vaccine. The vaccine does not in any way change our DNA. There's no tracking device in the DNA. So there are a lot of those myths out there. But I dare say that in the Black and brown community, the key is our religious leaders that support and understand the science. If I can use a biblical quote from 1 Corinthians 12:27, now you are the body of Christ, and each one of us is a part of it. And the church, God has appointed, first of all, apostles, second, prophets, third, teachers, then workers of miracles, and those having the gifts of healing, and finally, those able to help one another. And so I don't believe, and I think there are many pastors that don't believe that the science of medicine and faith are mutually exclusive. I think, God has given us all special talents, and I put myself and Dr. Williams in that latter category of those able to help others. But we've had these talents to build reason, to use our reason, create, and ultimately to serve. God doesn't give us a mind of reason and then say, it's okay to go play in the traffic. And by faith, he'll prevent the oncoming cars from hitting you. God gives us knowledge, tools, and wisdom to negotiate how to get across the street safely. He gives us traffic lights. He gives us crosswalks, traffic cops as tools of faith. And there are many pastors that have embraced this in the Black and brown community and are now standing up to say, utilize that faith and knowledge that God has given us and those able to help each other, which include our doctors and scientific community.
Excellent. Dr. Williams.
I agree with everything Dr. Parker said. And what I will add is I'm just going to throw it into the room. There is also a significant political undertone in some of the responses from our faith leaders across the country, across the country and across the racial spectrum. And when you infuse politics into this, it becomes really complicated. And a lot of politics has been infused into COVID-19 conversations. Some of that includes the individual versus a societal commitment, right? We are very much a very individualistic society. Okay, and we have to clearly understand that a culture of health really speaks to the fact that we're all in this together. Your health, Dr. Sadler, and your health, Dr. Parker, what you do affects my health, what I do affects your health. And we have to understand that. And as we continue to move as a society to more individualistic attitudes, behaviors, and actions, we will be confronted with this over and over and over again. If you look at the definition of public health, right? Public health and the policies that govern public health, it's really a population, community-based effort. It's not an individual effort. So that when you talk about, and I'm just going to use one simple example, when you talk about masking, right, in a community, masking to prevent transmission of disease, something that is free, something that is highly effective, something that we've known for for a long time. Ask Dr. Parker how many babies he's delivered without a mask on, right? It just doesn't happen. But somehow that was politicized, right? It was politicized. And depending on where you are in whether it be in the theological spectrum or not, depending on where your political beliefs are and where you subscribe, that's how your behaviors and your message has been delivered. And so I intentionally bring that into the room because some of this is not theological and some of this is not ethical. A lot of this is just plain old political, and we need to understand that as well.
Thank you so much. And I'm so glad that you brought in that notion of both ethics and politics to this conversation. You guys, it's wonderful to sit here and talk to you two brilliant gentlemen. I am gleaning a lot just listening to you. One of the concerns that some people have is that vaccinations are thought of as an individual thing. I'm going to get vaccinated because I want to protect myself. But is there a larger ethical responsibility to be vaccinated to protect others as well? Tell me a little bit about the ethical responsibility to be vaccinated. Dr. Parker?
Yeah, I think that, we have this strange dichotomy in the Black community. There's the vaccine hesitancy, mm-hmm. and then there's also the fear of the systemic racism eliminating us from access to the vaccine. So you have half the community saying, I'm scared to take it. And the other half of the community saying, we don't want to be at the back of the bus. We want to make sure we get our fair share. And where is ours? And it's the same split amongst our major religious factions. If you think about the Islamic community, for example, if you talk about the followers of Louis Farrakhan, you will find that, in my understanding, most of them are vehemently opposed to the vaccine. But that's hundreds of thousands of Muslims in the United States. But when you talk about Muslims worldwide, millions, most of the leadership of the Muslim community worldwide that I've seen and studied are very much in support of vaccine administration, overwhelmingly. And they think it's their moral duty in terms of protecting their fellow man. And that's why many of those leaders, I can speak to Mohammed Majid, the former president of the Islamic Association of North America, who has come out along with Muslims worldwide leadership that has said is their moral obligation to protect and promote the health and well-being of their community and their fellow people in their community. And so they're very much in support. And you'll find the same thing in the Baptist community. One of the most profound inspirations that I gleaned from the support came from the National Medical Association and a seminar that they had, a national seminar with Reed Tuxton of the Black Coalition Against COVID, and all of the various organizations, which included healthcare, science, research, political, and faith-based organizations. And that the leadership of all the Black medical schools, Howard, Meharry, Morehouse, Charles Drew, the National Medical Association of Black Doctors, the Black Coalition with Reverend Matthew Watley, Calvin Butts of Abyssinian Baptist Church in New York, and all of them that came together in support of the education and knowledge to get vaccinated. And, a lot of people don't know even that the vaccine was primarily driven and invented, if you will, by a Black woman, Dr. Kizzmekia Corbett, who was very instrumental as a virologist in developing the vaccine. There were trials of great participation, 9 to 10% of African Americans that were in the trials. So we were represented in the study. And so you have these great leaders, and, it comes down to who do you trust, and where are you getting your information from? My fear is that because of the political backlash, as Dr. Williams mentioned, a lot of people are turned off to cable news network MSNBC, and they're not getting information that they otherwise would have. And so that's the question: where are people getting their information, and who do they trust? And so I think that is a key component of how we need to utilize our leadership, particularly in the faith-based community, to propagate the correct message and support for vaccination.
Amen. Thank you for that. And I'm sort of anticipating this, listening to your conversation, the need to really help get the message out through African-American congregations, African-American churches, as we wrestle with this issue. So I might ask the question. I'll start with you, Dr. Williams. Unless you like, would you like to finish this question as well?
Go ahead. I'll weave it together with
Okay.
the question.
What would you like to see the Black church do on whole as we are in this pandemic? How can we be of assistance in helping to bring vaccines to the African-American community, to bring a message of support for vaccination? How can the Black church play a role in supporting this larger endeavor of helping people gain access to vaccines?
So first and foremost, I think the leadership of the Black church has a very strong voice, a very strong presence, and well trusted in the communities that's served by the African American church, and as such, are positioned really to help continue to educate and inform. That's really the key. You can't force people to do something, but you can meet them where they are, right? Don't judge them. That's first and foremost. But begin the educational process. When I say educational process, it's not just about vaccines, Dr. Sadler. I would say educate the educational process about medicine and science as a whole. Okay, because once COVID is managed, I won't say it's going to go away. Once it's effectively managed, there's another disease process that's going to take its place. Heart disease is going to bubble back up. Cancer is going to bubble back up in our communities. And so we have to really take a step back and say to ourselves, our communities are being devastated by health disparities. And we have the knowledge, okay? We do have folks of color that are in positions of influence in the medical establishment. You have Dr. Parker, myself, and others, many others. And so the statement that, well, we need more folks that look like us, absolutely we do, correct. However, those that are here are aligned with their messaging. They're aligned with their information. They're aligned with data and knowledge. And so I would say that the leadership of African American Church, we need to continue to partner together, develop deep partnerships. That's been our goal for a while. I know it's Dr. Parker's goal and my goal to partner with the leaders in the community so that we can transmit the correct, accurate information through trusted sources. That would be the first and foremost. Secondly, I would also say that we have to understand that we don't live in isolation. I'll go back to that individualistic. We are a people historically that have been a communal people, right? Historically, we took care of our elders and we worked as a communal society. We have to think about that and get away from the individual type of behavior and understand that what I do does have an impact on my neighbor, all right? Positive and negative. And so I think that when we continue to talk about working together as a society, a common good, a common goal, a common North Star, that will go a long ways.
So I love this notion of the Black church being involved in this larger communal effort. Well, one thing I wondered is there a role for the white church to play in helping to bridge the gap of disparities in healthcare? What is the role of the white church? What is the role of, let's say, an institution like the seminary, Union Presbyterian Seminary, in helping to bring a message of a sort of inclusion and trying to close the gaps in the healthcare system?
I'll start off first with that. First and foremost, I would like to have the white church, a majority church. One, going back to what Dr. Parker said earlier, have an understanding of the history, true history, the correct history of race and racism in this country, because that is the foundation for really understanding a lot of the health disparities out there. So once the white churches had an opportunity to educate themselves on race and racism in America, then I think they will be better equipped to transmit the message, right? Transmit the message, because then they become trusted, right? They become trusted because they've acknowledged the history, they understand the history. They don't own the history. I'm not saying they own it, right? Or blame. I'm saying understand and acknowledge it, because that goes a long way as it relates to trust. And then once you develop trust, then you can disseminate information, and that information can then be acted upon by communities of color. But it starts with trust.
Dr. Sadler, I'd like to say that, Dr. Williams has given me the privilege and honor to be a community ambassador. That's under his direction. And not only myself, but additional other physicians of color within Novant Healthcare that have a platform to go out and participate in Zoom platform or online educational sessions to engage different organizations to have these discussions. And I think it's very, very important. Many of those talks I've done have been with organizations that are predominantly Caucasian dominated organizations. Mm-hmm. That being said, I think, again, it comes down to what Dr. Williams just said, trust. Who do you trust? Now, they may not know me from Adam, but the question is, do you trust Dr. Fauci, one of the leading most authorities in this country? Well, the answer to that may be no for a lot of people in the Black community. But do you trust President Obama? Or do you trust Vice President Kamala Harris? Do you trust Mark Morial, the president of the Urban League? Do you trust, Dr. Leon McDougall, head of the National Medical Association? Well, those names may not mean anything to a lot of people in the community on a day-to-day basis. So then, do you trust celebrities? Samuel Jackson, Tyler Perry, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Al Roker, Spike Lee. But those are people that have propped themselves up in the community on national TV to support vaccine administration, particularly in the Black and brown community. And if that's too far for you, well, like my pastor says, come a little closer. Do you trust Harvey Gantt? Do you trust Vilma Leak? Do you trust Pastor Clifford Jones? Do you trust Ophelia Garman Brown? So some of these are iconic leaders in our communities that people do know some of those names and might trust them. So I think iconic leadership within our communities, and they don't all have to be pastors, but pastors are our leaders, both in the church, but they're also leaders in the community on social issues as well. So, and then ultimately the question becomes, who do you trust and where are you getting your information from? So, there's a very basic thing that people have to believe that there is a pandemic and what that represents. And then they have to know that if you believe that there was a pandemic, do you think that the vaccine has helped blunt the rise of the pandemic or has saved lives or stopped people from getting it? And if they're able to acknowledge that, then I think you can move to, well, I think each and every one of us has a friend, relative, or associate that has died from COVID. And then the follow-up question for me would be, don't you wish they had had access to that vaccine, which may have allowed them to still be here today? So, it's kind of like, do you wear a seatbelt? And if you don't, why? Well, some people say, well, I wear a seatbelt because I have to do that because it's the law. But once you get in the car, you can take it off. But do you believe the seatbelt saves lives? Do you think that that people that serve your food in a restaurant should have to wash their hands, wear a hairnet when they're preparing your food? Or do you just say, well, I'm just going to pray over the food and that's good enough for me? No, so there's things that are put in place that people have to acknowledge. And I think that's what I enjoy, having those rich conversations to try and bring some common sense to this process as well.
Amen. Thank you so much for that. We've been talking about vaccinations, and we've been talking about sort of a necessity of people getting vaccinated in this larger process. And you all have spoken quite eloquently and given us great convincing reasons why we need to do this, why it is imperative, why it is ethical for us to do so, why we as leaders in the congregational life, the church community, faith community need to be involved as well. Are there some people, though, that just should not get this vaccination? Are there some people out there that for various reasons have a legitimate cause not to become vaccinated? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, Dr. Williams.
Yes, there's some legitimate reasons, legitimate medical scientific reasons not to get vaccinated, and the list is fairly extensive. You know, those that have underlying problems that can be exacerbated by a vaccine, things of that nature. First and foremost, I always say check with your primary care physician first, who knows you best, who knows your history best, who knows the medical problems that could be potentially exacerbated or complicated by the vaccine. That's first and foremost. Then, if based on the recommendations from your primary care physician, you should not get vaccinated, there are other things that you can do to mitigate getting COVID, right? And I mentioned masking earlier. Very highly effective, inexpensive opportunity to reduce a transmission of disease. So first and foremost, always check with your primary care physician. Yes, there are certain medical scientific reasons not to get vaccinated, but I will say, Dr. Sadler, that is not the majority. That is the minority of individuals across this country that fit in that category.
Thank you for that.
And Rodney, if I may add, probably one of the things that we monitor when we give people the vaccine is an allergic or anaphylaxis, serious allergic reaction that can compromise breathing and heart rate and things like that. And probably, one of those ingredients, polyethylene glycol, is one of the most ingredients that people would have a reaction to. So if anyone has a reaction or knowingly has a reaction to polyethylene glycol, that would be a contraindication, or if they have a compromised immune system. One little piece of science that I want to throw in there, and Dr. Williams can probably speak to this better than I can, but as we blunt the rise of COVID and the numbers are coming down, I think there are people in the Black and brown community that say, well, it's over. Why should I get it now? And, I don't need to get it now because it looks like things have returned to normal. And I think we've got to push the message out that the way the vaccine can continue to come back and cause these variants is that if the vaccine needs a host, it needs to host someone to replicate, modify its DNA and change to form these variants. If everybody's vaccinated, there's no host. It can't do that. But if we have people that are unvaccinated and they come in contact with COVID, therein lies the problem where the virus can get into their system, replicate, change, and create these variants that ultimately could make our vaccines less effective or even necessitate the need for boosters and things like that. So I want to emphasize that point, and I'd ask Dr. Williams to join me in commenting on that because he's probably more knowledgeable about that than I am.
No, you summed it up correctly, Dr. Parker. What we're concerned about now are variants, right? And we really need to suppress the current strains that are out there so that it doesn't give an opportunity for variants to develop and reduce the effectiveness and or eliminate the effectiveness of the current vaccines that we have available out there. So even though we are slowly moving away from this pandemic, we're not out of it yet. We still encourage all individuals to get vaccinated. The other thing that I would add here is that prior to COVID, there was very little, and I'm not suggesting that there should, be an increased lay person understanding of vaccines and medical care and things of that nature. But there's been a very heightened sense of focus on vaccines because of COVID. And I want to share with the audience that first and foremost, no vaccine is 100%. The COVID-19 vaccine gets as close to as you can get. Most people don't realize that the flu vaccine is only about 40% effective, whereas the COVID-19 vaccine is about 95% effective. And so what we're seeing, or what we saw in the last 12 to 14 months, is for the first time, the lay population really is digging into scientific method, understanding vaccines, understanding percentages of being immune, herd immunity, the list goes on and on and on. And so some of these topics are somewhat new to individuals, but they've been very much commonplace for decades and decades and decades in other illnesses. We all know children get vaccinated before going to schools for a variety of childhood illnesses, measles, mumps, rubella, all that sort of stuff. This is really a variation on the theme. And so that if you are comfortable with your child, and some folks are not, just be transparent, but if you're comfortable in understanding of the need for vaccines against measles, mumps, rubella, things of that nature, then let's extend that knowledge, extend that understanding to this very deadly disease.
Thank you.
Yeah, there are nearly 14 illnesses that we pretty much have forgotten about because of vaccines. And sometimes I'll ask you'll have people that I say, well, I don't believe in vaccines. I don't believe in vaccines. And I'll say to them, did you go to public school? Or they'll say, well, yeah. I said, well, oh, so did you have a religious exemption, or did your parents have you vaccinated against mumps, measles, chickenpox, smallpox? And the thing is, in the 1800s, vaccines came about. There were 300 million people that died from smallpox. We have virtually eliminated many of those childhood diseases. I would sometimes ask people, well, didn't you hear about the 100 million people that died yesterday of polio? And they say, no, I didn't hear about that. I'll say, because it didn't happen, because we have vaccines that have eliminated polio, mumps, measles. Now you have the anti-vaxxers, and now you're seeing a rise in some of those childhood diseases in some countries. So that should be a lesson to us right there.
Thank you so much. And I love that notion of, yeah, so have you heard about all the people that died of rubella, or of mumps? And people don't even, you're right, we don't even think about these diseases anymore that were once so virulent and so damaging to entire populations of human beings. Thank you for that. That's going to stick with me for a while now. I wanted to ask a question that would, just because I have you experts here, but let me I want to take some questions from the audience before I get back to it. One question is from Mark Davis, and he's talking about this notion of the STEM program. As we're talking about closing the gap and getting more people into the medical profession, what is the role of encouraging our young people to get involved with STEM programs? And how can we go about doing that? How can we encourage more of our young people to start preparing for careers in the medical industry? Dr. Parker?
Thanks, Dr. Sadler. I'll start, and I'm sure Dr. Williams has comments on that as well. I think, you don't wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning and say, I'm going to run a marathon. There's a little bit of preparation that's involved. Yeah. And so you have to start, and I seriously believe I tried to outline the importance of education as a foundation for any success in whatever chosen endeavor you might choose. Mm-hmm. But I think part of that is modeling. And I think this Black Men in White Coats, some of the programs where we have an opportunity to go into the middle schools. I've spoken at elementary, middle schools, high schools, college. When I go into elementary schools, I wear my white coat and stethoscope. I take other physicians of color with me because, as they say, you can't be it unless you see it. And so just them seeing and playing with the stethoscopes and things like that and talking about how we help people, we create our own element of heroism, if you will, for those children. In middle school, they're much more inquisitive. And I've engaged in programs such as robotics program. I mentioned that I was privileged to be the director of robotic surgery. Mm-hmm. And we've had classrooms of now the school systems have these robotic competitions where the robots battle it out in an arena. But just the mechanical engineering and interest in that and how it is incorporated into the field of medicine is fascinating. We've had those kids come to simulation labs where they can engage in and generate their interest. We also have to be realistic and lay down the foundation of the value of being excellent in science and math. And through these STEM programs, it gives them those opportunities to pursue a career in science or medicine. Not everybody has to be a doctor. We need researchers. We need nursing. We need physical therapists. We need people that study things like Dr. Kizmika Corbett that I mentioned earlier, was instrumental in virology and helping develop the vaccine. So we need young people to engage in health and science in every aspect as it moves toward a career in healthcare. And then at the collegiate level, there are certain prerequisites that you have to have, and we need to mentor those young people in terms of navigating the treacherous minefields, both in terms of strategic things like how to pick what courses, their coursework, supporting them financially so that they can take prep courses like Kaplan courses to prepare for the MCAT and those sorts of things, and have coaching sessions as to how to do that. I was privileged to serve on several medical school admissions committees. Another thing we're doing is educating the medical school admissions committees about implicit racial bias and how they need to understand those things when we're selecting candidates for medical school. So those are some of the things that we're doing, and I'll defer to Dr. Williams to add to that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I will start off exactly with what Dr. Parker said. You have to start at an early age, okay? You have to stress academic excellence at an early age. Math, science, what have you. Doesn't matter if you're thinking about medicine or not, but stress academic excellence at an early age. Now, not all of us have the opportunity to have either parents or guardians that can afford us that opportunity. So the next step is mentorship programs. Dr. Parker talked a lot about mentorship programs and exposure and modeling, right? And that's part of the reason that I developed the Physician Ambassador Program, which is now called a Provider Ambassador Program, because it's more than just physicians. It's because we have a rich cadre of physicians who are interested in the communities, interested in communities of color. And so creating a platform for them to go out and engage in the community. You'd be surprised how much influence you have over an individual when Dr. Parker walks into that elementary school or junior high school with that white coat on and that stethoscope and the eyes open up. I can be like that gentleman right there. Okay, that model type of behavior. So it's very important that we have mentorship modeling as we are engaged with our communities. Dr. Parker also brought up something that is very important. Once individuals get into a school or get into a tract of say STEM education, it's not good enough just to be there, right? There are many barriers and obstacles and challenges that people of color often face. Sometimes they have to drop out of school because they have to take care of a family member, to take care of a younger sibling. So those support services, and not just mentorship, but sponsorship, right? Sponsorship, which takes mentorship to the next level. Sponsor is one that will open the door, kick down the door, put you at the table so that you have exposure to different disciplines, different folks. The more that you can get exposed out there, the more likely you are to go on a particular trajectory. So I would start by saying, let's start it early on. Let's start modeling early on. Let's start the mentorship and sponsorship early on in a child's education.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I love that idea. And as we are an educational institution, emphasizing education at a young age is significant. I think that might also be a great way of white churches and Black churches partnering together to create that environment in which we provide not only the support and encouragement, but even the financial resourcing for African Americans to go on to do careers in medicine. That would be a wonderful way of finding ways of partnership. There are a number of questions that are popping up. One question had to do with something I was going to ask you about before, but Audrey May asked a question about, is there a danger to a vaccine that, quote unquote, she said, alters your genetic background? And I think she's talking about the messenger RNA in the Pfizer vaccine, I think Moderna as well. Tell me a little bit about that. Is there some inherent danger to this? And you mentioned a little bit about this before, Dr. Williams.
So to be very direct and clear, there is no alteration of one's genetic material with the vaccine, period.
Okay.
I'm going to pause there for a second. You don't want that to sink in. There is no alteration of one's genetic material with the vaccine. That's not how the vaccine works. And we can get into the scientific aspects of it, and I know we don't have the time for it, but just to be very direct and clear, that does not exist. And that's one of the fallacies that's out there that we have to continue to work against.
Thank you. Dr. Parker, did you want to just say amen?
Amen.
Thank you so much.
Sometimes, Dr. Sadler, I like to keep it real simple because sometimes you start getting very involved in the science of it, and I'm happy to go down that whole rabbit hole, but it's really yes, no. It does not have any effect on one's genetic material. Now we can move on to the next, potential barrier.
And I want you to know that this is actually a question that has come up with so many different people. That, along with the issue of what's Bill Gates's role in the vaccine. Did Anthony Fauci start the pandemic with his lab in Wuhan? All of these sort of conspiracy theories have contributed, I think, to the fear that has gone into people taking advantage of it. And I don't want to in any way besmirch anyone who holds these opinions. I think some people have developed opinions and done research that has led them in these directions. But I want us to know what the facts are. And I've appreciated today having a conversation with Dr. Jerome Williams, with Dr. Gus Parker, who've given us the background, the medicine behind the vaccines, and why it is that people, particularly African Americans and Latinx people, need to be taking advantage of this opportunity in the midst of this pandemic. We are about 2 minutes out. Let me do this. Let me just ask for any final comments from both of you in 30 seconds. Dr. Williams.
My final comments are that I'm going to continue to work with our communities, continue to educate our communities, continue to meet people where they are without judgment, so that I become a trusted individual in these communities to impart the information that I know will benefit our communities, both from a health and human services standpoint as well as a medical standpoint. But it really starts with me understanding our communities, being present in our communities, being partners in our communities, so that we can curb not just COVID-19 disparate outcomes, but all disparate outcomes that we know exist out there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams, for your time today and for your wisdom and insight for us all as we sit here. Dr. Parker.
Well, I can't say it any better. I think, first of all, we have to acknowledge our past and our history with people that have a reluctance and hesitancy, and understand, and as Dr. Williams said, meet them where they are. We have to engage their trust. I think as medical professionals, as people in a position of leadership, we need to listen sometimes more than we talk, and listen to what their concerns are and address them in the most respectful way. And at the end, allow them the space to stay secure in their own beliefs. But we will continue the good work. I believe this is rooted in my faith as well. And it's a challenge for all of us, but I think it will lead to better health care for all.
Thank you so much, Dr. Parker. I just want to say thank you to everybody who's joined this conversation today. This has been a wonderful opportunity to hear from two brilliant scholars, two brilliant physicians, practitioners, who are talking about why it is that we need to take full advantage of vaccines, why it is that we need to begin to work to close the disparities that exist in healthcare across the color lines, why it is that we need to make sure that our young people are being given those resources, those skills from an early age so that they can find their own vocations in being a physician, being a researcher, or being part of the larger support system that helps us close the disparities in the healthcare system. Thank you all for joining us today. And as a minister, let me just say, we all have a theological responsibility. Dr. Parker and Dr. Williams have lifted this up, theological and ethical responsibility, not just to ourselves, but to the larger community, to make sure we're doing everything that we can to ensure not just our own health, but the health of the larger community. Let's do our parts. Let's make sure that we are pushing forward to not just eliminate the COVID-19 pandemic, but to make sure that we are helping all people gain access to healthcare. If Dr. King was right, if the Bible was right, that we were all created in God's image and therefore worthy of respect, then shouldn't we make sure that everybody is protected with our healthcare system? Thank you all for being with us. I'm going to turn it back over to the voice as he closes us out today. Dr. Parker, Dr. Williams, I'll talk to you in just a second. God bless you all. And let me end with a bit of a prayer. God, we have been in the midst of a horrible pandemic for this last year. We have struggled mightily, and we've seen Black and brown folks fall at precipitously high rates, but we know that you are in control. Even as we gather today, we ask that some heart might be touched, that someone might decide to do the right thing, to take advantage of the situation that might help their health or the health of someone else. We ask that though you would be with people in their conscience and that you would be the guide, that you would give them direction as to what decisions they need to make. But at the end of the day, Lord, we ask that you would protect everyone made in your image and give us all access to health, to fullness of shalom, to your ultimate peace. We pray in many names. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Turn it over to you, my brother. Mike, God bless.
Thank you, Dr. Sadler, and thank you all for watching. Save the date for our next discussion, June 29th, for a lunchtime webinar on queer justice. Watch your email for details. Until then, enjoy the rest of your day.